Now we're going to start chapter 5 of biology, the function of the large biological molecules or biomolecules. There's 4 of them in the body. And this is the last chapter we're going to cover before we have our first test, just to scare you a little bit. Okay. All right. So we have molecules of life. Again, they're called biomolecules, and there's actually only 4 major groups. The first one is carbohydrates, made out of carbon and hydrogen. There's lipids, which another name for is fats, proteins, and nucleic acid. Those 4 are what we call biomolecules, and they pretty much make up living things. Okay, they're macromolecules. Excuse me. That means they're very large and they're very complex. Okay, they have unique properties because of the arrangement of their atoms. Okay, the way they set things up gives them the properties and makes them. They each have their own unique functions, and their functions are based on the way they're set up, and that's what gives them their unique properties. Boy, I said that same way twice, didn't I? Sorry about that. Okay, so the macromolecules, and I don't know why this is set up this way, but we'll go through it, you guys. They're called polymers. Polymers means a lot. Every single unit would be a monomer. If you were making something out of Legos, each individual Lego would be a monomer. And then when you put them all together to make your great huge structure, your big building or whatever you are making, that would be a polymer. Okay, so polymer is a very large molecule made of all these little monomers. Okay, so the repeating units, again, like I said, if you're making a Lego structure, each individual Lego would be a monomer. And the structure, when it's all finished, that would be a polymer. Okay, and again, 3 of the 4 classes of organic things are polymers. Carbohydrates, and another name for carbohydrates, you guys, is like sugars. Okay, proteins, most of us know proteins, and nucleic acids. The ones we're missing out of here is lipids or fats, and they're set up a little different. Okay, so when we need to get rid of them, we need to break them down, because we do that. Our body does that. When you eat a hamburger, it's made out of a certain kind of protein, and we need to break it down into its smaller parts because it's in a protein form that we can't use. So what we do is we take that protein and we break it down into smaller pieces called amino acids, and then we rebuild it into the proteins that we need. So in our body, we have specialized proteins called enzymes, and their job is to make or break down these polymers. Okay, break them down from a large molecule into small pieces so that we can reform them. It'd be like when your little brother comes in and breaks up all your Lego structures, and then you got to build something else. Okay, so we have enzymes, again, which are a special protein that need to be made, but their job is to speed up these chemical reactions that either make or break down these polymers. And again, a lot of times we take polymers and we break them down into monomers, and then we rebuild them into structures that we need. Okay, they do it through 2 processes. One is a dehydration, and just like it sounds, it means to remove the oxygen, because you'll see that there's hydrogen and oxygen in these biomolecules. So sometimes the monomers bonds will be broken because you take out the water, and that's a dehydration. And or sometimes we add water. Okay, polymers can be disassembled by what they call hydrolysis, and again, that's the reverse of dehydration. Okay, so these 2 reactions, dehydration and hydrolysis, are 2 of the ways that we break polymers down into monomers or build monomers into polymers. Okay. Okay, so carbohydrates are our quick energy. They're our fuel, they're our building materials. Okay, and like I said before, carbohydrates is sugars. Okay, and polymers is sugars. So a polymer of sugar would be like starch. Okay, the simplest carbohydrates are called monosaccharides or simple sugars. Examples would be like glucose, which I think I've talked about before, is the simplest sugar, the one that plants make. There's also fructose, which is fruit sugar. There's dextrose, and you'll hear dextrose a lot if you work in a medical field. Dextrose is kind of sucrose, is an easy way of putting sugar into people. You know, when people really, really, really need to have energy right now, they'll use dextrose, and it's very similar to glucose. So there's all kinds of monosaccharides. It's just one of the units, the simple sugars. Okay, if you put a bunch of monosaccharides together, you can end up with a polysaccharide. Okay, And again, that's like the Lego thing. Each individual Lego is a monosaccharide. When you put a whole bunch of monosaccharides together, you put a whole bunch of Legos together and you get your structure. That's a polymer or a polysaccharide, okay? So there are monosaccharides, there are disaccharides, and then there are polysaccharides, okay? And again, a disaccharide is formed when you put two monosaccharides together, but you take out some water. And the most common disaccharide is sucrose. That would be the sugar, table sugar, okay? There's a couple other ones, but really sucrose is probably the one you talk about most. Another one would be maltose, malt sugar. And yeah, lactose is a simple sugar. So there really isn't a lot of disaccharides, but sucrose, obviously we use a lot of sucrose. That's one of our, yeah, we like sugar. We like that sweet taste. So sucrose is a disaccharide. And again, that's the most common. Okay. So we have these polysaccharides, and that's really, we get monosaccharides and polysaccharides. There's more common. There's not a lot of disaccharides, but one of in plants, what we count on is they store their saccharides, their sugars in a form of polysaccharide called starch. And all starches is a whole bunch of glucose monomers stuck together. Okay, it's a way to store food well, you know, that nummy potato, pasta, all that stuff. When you're eating those, you're getting starch, and starch is a bunch of glucose molecules stuck together. And you might well think, well, if it's a bunch of glucose, shouldn't it be sweet? You can do this if you take a cracker, which is made out of a lot of starch, and chew it, and don't swallow. Chew it for a long time. You'll find out that the enzymes in your mouth break it down into the glucose, and it'll start to taste sweet. I don't recommend it because it takes a while, but you know, if you really want to prove me wrong, give it a shot. Okay. Plants, again, use starch to store their food sources, and they do it within the chloroplast and something called a plastid. A plastid is in the same group as chloroplast, but it doesn't make food, it stores food. Okay. And the simplest form of starch is called amylose. And we have an enzyme, called amylase that actually breaks it down into those simple sugars. So again, if you eat pasta, you're eating starch. Your body will break it down into those glucose molecules that we can rearrange any way we want. We don't use starch in its form. We got to break it down from a polysaccharide into its monosaccharides, and then we can use it. Okay. The way we store polysaccharides is called glycogen. Okay. And we tend to store glycogen in our liver and in our muscles. Okay. And again, it's the same thing as starch. It's a bunch of glucose molecules stored together, but it's a little different because, again, animals and plants are a little bit different. Okay. And again, we can use up this store. If you've ever watched like a marathon and you see some poor soul that needs to finish that marathon so bad, but they're just weaving and they just, you know, they're really struggling to finish. What has happened is they've used up all their glycogen store in their muscles, and they're just struggling to keep their muscles moving. So you can use up your glycogen. It's an easy fix. All you have to do is eat. But we have, you know, we store it in our muscles and we store it in our liver, and it's our source of energy. Okay. So what we do, hydrolysis, remember, is adding water to glycogen, and then it releases the glucose into our bloodstream, and then the blood takes it to wherever it needs us, usually our muscles. So wherever the sugar demand is, that the glycogen will be released by, again, hydrolysis, adding water to it, and, you know, taking off a little chunk of it, sending it wherever it needs to go, and then that gives you the energy you need. So plants store energy or their food as starch. We store it as glycogen. But in both cases, it's a lot of monosaccharides put together to make a polysaccharide. Okay. So, and there's one other polysaccharide that plants use. It's called cellulose, and they use it in their cell walls. Now, see, plants don't have bones, so they have to have something to give them structure. So in their plant, on the outside of the cell, they have an extra layer of, we'll call it toughness. And what it does is it makes plant cells like bricks, so that, you know, this is why plants can stand up. Okay, they don't have bones, so they don't have that option. So they have one more polysaccharide. It's called cellulose. And we use cellulose as fiber in our diet. Okay, cellulose has no nutritional value in that sense, but it's really important to have your cellulose so that you keep regular, and the fiber in your diet is important so that you don't get colon cancer. Okay. And starch is very similar. I mean, cellulose is very similar to starch. It's a polymer of glucose, but it's just a little bit different. Okay. And again, what it does is it gives structure to the plant cells so they can stand up. Okay. Lipids. Okay. Lipids are another name for fats. Okay. And they're one class of very large biological molecules that don't have true polymers. What they are is they're like chains that are kind of linked together, but they're a little bit different than the other three. Okay. Their unifying feature is they don't mix with water. So we talked about the other ones, they go through hydrolysis or dehydration. Well, fats really can't do that because they really don't mix with water. So they're different in that sense, okay? They are non-polar, okay? They don't have the positive and negative end, so water has no effect on them, okay? They're hydrophobic because they have those non-polar covalent bonds. In other words, they have equal sharing. And we talked a little bit about this before. Remember, if they have unequal sharing, they have a positive end and a negative end. And water is the most common of all those, and we call it a universal solvent because it can pull things apart because of its poles. But fats, lipids, they're hydrophobic. Phobic meaning they don't really like water. I don't know if they're really afraid of it, but water doesn't affect them. Okay? So again, the important lipids are fats, phospholipids, which are in cells, we'll talk about more, and then steroids. Okay. Now, some people think, well, you should never eat fats because fats are bad for you. That's not true. Fats are an amazing source of energy, and we need fats in our plant. I mean, in our cell membranes. We need fats to cover our organs to protect them. So we need fat. It's just that most of us, myself included, I tend to overdo it on the fats, if you know what I mean. But they're the ones that taste the best. Okay. So fats are constructed by two smaller molecules. There's one called glycerol, and then there's fatty acids. I don't know if any of you hear about people getting their blood tested for their triglycerides. They're checking on their fat level. Okay. But anyway, they're stuck together. It's really kind of a 3-carbon alcohol is glycerol. And then you'll get these three, and they'll have a hydroxyl group. Hydroxyl is just OH. Okay. It's water minus 1 hydrogen. Okay. And that attaches them together. So you end up with 3 of these chains. And then what will happen is you'll take these glycerol groups, triglycerides. That's why there's 3 of them. And then they attach themselves to a fatty acid. Okay. So fats are a little bit different, or lipids, if you want to call them that, are a little bit different than the other biomolecules in that they don't go through the normal reactions. They can't be dehydrated, or you can't add water to them to make the reaction occur because they just don't mess with water. Water doesn't affect them. Okay. They vary in length and the number of carbons. There's 2 things to remember about the fats. Okay. If you have a carbon chain and it has all single bonds. Okay. Now, we talked about single and double bonds before. Single bonds, 1 set of electrons they're sharing. Double bond, they have 2. Well, when you have a double bond, what happens is you have a place to add stuff. Okay. You can break that down. If it's all single bonds, you don't have that. So if they're all single bonds, they're called saturated fatty acids. If they have 1 or more double bond, and they can have a double bond, they can have a triple bond, but if they have these bonds, more than single bonds, they're unsaturated. And if you remember from your commercials, which one's better for you? Unsaturated is. And the reason for that is your body can attach to it because you've got these bonds to break and can get rid of it. Saturated fatty acids, they stay in your bloodstream and they build up. And they give you things like a hardening of the arteries, arteriosclerosis, and then people have to have bypasses and all that. So if you have a choice between fatty acids, you should always go with the unsaturated, okay? And you'll see that. Saturated fatty acids are solid at room temperatures, and they mostly come from animal fats. Unsaturated fatty acids are usually fats or oils. They're liquid at room temperature, and they come from plants. So corn oil and olive oil and all those are unsaturated. Crisco and things like that, and butter, those are saturated. So the ones that are better for you are the unsaturated. And we're just about done, up to our 15 minutes. So we'll quit here and we'll do one more lecture about this chapter.